Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
If you are in adult education in any shape, form or another, you have a responsibility to those learners to make sure that what happens to them is fair, it's appropriate, it's robust, that they get every opportunity they can to learn in a way that works well for them, and then to prove that their learning has led to changes in their thinking, their understanding, their behaviour. What is the quality of the learning experience? Are the learners given access to good quality materials? Are they given the time they need to learn something? Are we taking account of any reasonable adjustments we might have to make? The figures on neurodiversity are huge, because neurodiversity is quite a wide spectrum of situations for individuals, and so it's very, very common that people will have specific needs, far more common than I think is well understood. And there are things that you can do that just give an even playing field for those learners. The very early days of thinking you have everybody sitting in serried rows and desks facing the front, and you mustn't think for yourself ever. Well, learning is not something that happens to you. It's something you do, you learn, and you therefore need to be the one taking responsibility for that. And the role of the tutor and the role of the assessor is to give everybody the best possible opportunity to prove what they've learned and what they can do as a result. It's not about how good you are at broadcasting stuff. It's about how good you are at encouraging that learning process.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. Candace, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Pete. Good to see you again. How are you?
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, really, really good this morning. I think I'm trying to cast my mind back, actually. Didn't we first meet maybe 2 or 3 years ago at the Emergency Services Show? I remember pulling you aside. That's pulling
right,
you
we
aside.
did it.
We had a bit of a chat just around the context of it. I probably learnt about SFJ many, many years before that, but it was probably when I first started seeing apprenticeships come full swing and started adding a lot of value into, I suppose, sector as a whole and society, but then also my first interaction with you. So it was great that you were able to sort of carve some time out. I wanted to start by framing this conversation for people in and around sort of learning, growing, challenging ourselves, both that we more widely think of personal development. It's essential, first and foremost, for all of us, and we should never sort of stop it as soon as education finishes. Some people think like they get to 19 or 20, but with all the developments happening in our personal, professional lives, it's fair to say that the only constant that we should all expect is change. So continuous innovative change, both in sectors and technology and everything like that. So personal development is something we should all continue to dip into throughout our entire lives. And I wanted to try and expand this today by speaking about Skills for Justice. So Skills for Justice it's a non-profit or it's a not-for-profit organization committed to the development and improvement of sustainable workforces across the UK's justice, fire and rescue, local government and armed forces sector. Have I missed any there?
No, that's it. But I mean, we also have some involvement in health and social care as well. So we have a few elements there, and actually some of the crossover areas. So, for example, among some of the things that we do really is to take some of the learning from work we've done in health sector bodies into, say, fire and rescue or policing, or vice versa. So because we work across the totality, really, of the so-called protective services and the health and social care sectors within the group that we're part of, we can actually combine experiences from different places and say, well, don't, leapfrog over what somebody else has done. Don't just make the same mistakes they did. Take something else from their learning and you make it yours.
I think we're some of the worst ones for that, with the greatest respect in the fire and rescue services. There's a lot of old boys, this is the way it was done kind of mentality. But actually, you made a great reference there, because I think the health and welfare sector is absolutely exploding. And there's like, I could even go straight down a rabbit hole with that, because as we have an ever-growing aging population, that is just the next 10 or 15 years, probably even the next 2 or 3 decades, that sector is colossal. And we've all seen the reports of people not doing it well, or ill practices, and not good development, not good learning in different sectors, but certainly in the welfare sector. So getting that right for all of our families, loved ones, as we get into that sector is such a crucial thing. But no, I love that you brought that up for me. So yourself, Candace Miller, it's a pleasure to welcome to the podcast. You're the executive director for SFJ, and you head the consultancy, research, and learning services directorate, supporting organizations to gaining outstanding results through skills development, workforce, and service redesign. How did you kind of get into this sector? Give us that whistle-stop tour.
Oh, okay. So this is actually, well, it's a family history, very potted. Okay. So my father was the first person in his family ever to go to higher education. So he went to university. So he was completely committed to learning. My mother had to leave school at 15 because of financial pressures on her family. She didn't get any qualifications. She went back to learning in her middle years. Wow. She not only did she gain her teaching qualification, she became a head teacher within very short order, got nominated on behalf of Scottish Education Authority to go to a reception at the Palace. And the pair of them really placed in my family's head the importance of not just learning, but a love of learning. And I still do that. So I'm always learning. You know, there's some silly things that I picked up during the pandemic was I started learning Norwegian for no particularly good reason, other than that we do have some family background in the Scandinavian countries. And I just thought, well, why not? So,
you look at that. Is it Duolingo? I know there's a great...
I do. I love it. I love it. I love it. Absolutely brilliant.
And this is where I think about SFJ, because it's about innovating old historical methods in a way that's more tangible, more engaging, more usable for today's sector. And Duolingo is another wonderful example of that, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, that sort of innovation and technology is also something that drives a lot of the improvements in education and learning as we're going forward. I mean, I'm just going to slightly correct you. I'm not really in charge of the consultancy and research side. I'm an executive director within the group within which SFJ sits, and I have therefore some across organisational responsibilities. But my primary responsibility nowadays is in our awarding body arm, so SFJ Awards. So I'm particularly responsible for that, and that's where, you know, that's for me, that's like coming home, because although I've worked across workforce development, education, learning, and training, those are my first loves. So it's brilliant.
It's so important to have, and this is why I wanted to have this conversation, because subject matter experts in that field are actually quite difficult. And it's something I'm speaking to a lot of our instructors now. I work in a training and development department, and we're getting a lot of new career managers and other instructors come in. And it's trying to shift that mindset for people that you are now in adult education. Yes. You are not just coaching somebody like you. Not that, and I'm sure football teams at the weekends, they all have their own awarding bodies as well. But this is a different thing. You know, adult education for people, and they think it's just words for the sake of words, like we're playing silly word games. It's not. And especially as a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations, but certainly, again, relating it back to the fire and rescue service, a lot of places are trying to go through this apprenticeship, and you'll correct me, I'll stomp all over terminology throughout this, but they're trying to get their accreditations, they're trying to adhere to the right standards, and that's quite difficult, because you're now coming into the realms of Ofsted and Ofqual, and you had to adhere to certain things. So I know I've trampled all over that, but can you try and muddle together some of the puzzle of those words for me?
Sure. So look, it's actually, you can make it complicated, but it's really quite simple. The basic tenet and the basic important fact to bear in mind is, if you are in adult education in any shape, form or another, you have a responsibility to those learners to make sure that what happens to them is fair, it's appropriate, it's robust, that they get every opportunity they can to learn in a way that works well for them, and then to prove that their learning has led to changes in their thinking, their understanding, their behaviour. and all of the rules and regulations. So Ofsted looks at the quality of the educational provision. Ofqual looks at the quality of the assessment processes that take place.
Just pause there. Sorry, because I don't want you to skip over that bit, because that makes sense to you. But even for me, we can't have as quick a description of that. So Ofsted help us adhere to the delivery of it. Is that right?
How we teach. What is the quality of the learning experience? Okay. Are the learners given access to good quality materials? Are they given the time they need to learn something? Are we taking account of any reasonable adjustments we might have to make?
I was about to say, this is where, Ofsted really have a lot to do now with a lot of the neurodiversity work. So when we're trying to, we just said there about technology and different resources and different learning styles. So that's where that might sit under. Was that my hearing?
Yes, it is. It is. That's correct. So, I mean, the figures on neurodiversity are huge, because neurodiversity is quite a wide spectrum of situations for individuals, and so it's very, very common that people will have specific needs, far more common than I think is well understood. And there are things that you can do that just give an even playing field for those learners. One of the things that I'm quite passionate about, if real equality, diversity and inclusion in learning for everybody. So as well as my role within SFJ, I'm also a member of the board of the Federation of Awarding Bodies here in the UK, where I lead for them on equity, diversity and inclusion. So this is kind of a real issue for me. But, the way I would describe that, and this applies to neurodiversity, but also to other forms of difference, is that you don't give, it's not equality, it's about equity. So you don't give, if you think of somebody standing trying to look over a wall, there's a lovely little image about that.
I love it. You're about the boxes and the fence.
Exactly.
That is it.
It's great. If you give everybody, but it's true, if you give everybody the same box, the smaller people...
I've given them all a laptop. What's the problem?
What's the problem?
Well, okay, so
they can't use it. It doesn't work like that. You have to look at the individual. What does this individual need to be really getting the best learning experience and opportunity they can? And then the same applies in assessment. So if we know that a learner has been given a reasonable adjustment during their training program, we can build that into the assessment process in the awarding body. And we do that. I actually would put a marker right here for anybody that's listening in to say that I don't think in our education and training across fire and rescue, across policing, across most of the public services, we recognise that need well enough. We just don't.
Absolutely not. We just go, we're looking for a good egg, whatever the good egg is. And if they can't get it, we just go, they're rubbish, or they're stupid, or they're not made of the right stuff, whatever that stuff is, because we're so in that almost dictatorial manner of projecting information at people, and if we throw enough mud against the wall, some of it will stick. And it just really makes me think. People hear neurodiversity and they go, "Oh, what's this new?" It's not a new thing. We've given a term to something that's always existed. And I think to myself, how many wonderful first responder operators and teachers and whatever have fallen at the altar of poor neurodiverse teaching methods, have not become successful, wonderful people, and how many students have not benefited from their input because they just weren't given the tools or the adaptations to be able to be successful.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of scientific inquiry has in recent years been going into how best you can adjust things to cater for different requirements. And a simple one, for example, would be in an interview situation, let's say. If you give people ahead of time, these are the sorts of questions I'm going to ask you. People who are not got a neurodiverse condition, I hate that word, but I'm going to use it in this context. Somebody who's not neurodiverse, they will do just as well as if you give them the questions at the time. Somebody who is neurodiverse, particularly people on the autistic spectrum, who are anxious in social situations like an interview often anyway, and who will find that anxiety can get in the way of their thinking processes, they become a little bit less anxious and they'll do a better job. So why would we not do that?
Their mental bandwidth, 20 or 30% of that mental bandwidth is already taken up because of this anxious reaction to the environment itself. But like you say, it would be no better or worse for the person. It's not an advantage, because it doesn't make a difference to those that don't have that neurodiversity. But for other students, I've started doing this with releasing materials like 3 or 4 weeks ahead of a course, and people have gone, oh, but what if they go out into a station and they start pitching? They're like, well, for first and foremost, it goes along with context of they will not participate in any physical activity. This is purely for them and their mentors on stations to go through stuff. There's drawings, there's videos, there's written content. So we can widen the gap of practical application when it comes into the safe environment of the training department, but we can we can extend that encoding and onboarding of that initial before we start going into memory recall and trying to apply it practically and adding interference and stuff like that. But some people are still in that mindset of, no, this is a 5-day course. We're going to throw it at you for 5 days. But it's almost very elitist. Well, it is very elitist in itself to go, you're all going to get exactly the same result because you've all got the same learning cycle in 5 days. How obnoxious almost for us to make that assumption of anyone.
Yeah, exactly. And well, it's very old-fashioned thinking, isn't it? It sort of almost goes back to the very early days of thinking you have everybody sitting in serried rows and desks facing the front, and you mustn't think for yourself ever. Yeah. Well, learning is not something that happens to you. It's something you do, you learn, and you therefore need to be the one taking responsibility for that. And the role of the tutor and the role of the assessor is to give everybody the best possible opportunity to prove what they've learned and what they can do as a result. It's not about how good you are at broadcasting stuff. It's about how good you are at encouraging that learning process.
I always say to people, and on the corner, and I'm the eternal student trying to get better at this, and I'm still very new into the training department as well, but I always have in the corner of my room the say again board, because I always say to people, look, anything that doesn't quite land or we don't quite hit, put it on the say again board in one of our break times, because it's not just that you've not got it. Yeah. Pete has said it in Pete's way, in his own self-bias. Yes. He's not got so I'll get another instructor to say it, or we'll go outside and we'll do it practically, or we'll pull up another resource. It's not that you've failed because you didn't get it. I always think of it like we're reaching across the void. Like there's 100% void here. I might need to reach 80%, or I might only need to reach 20% on each subject matter, depending on where you are. It's about taking you from what you know to what you don't know, from where you are to where you're not.
Exactly.
And trying to shorten that gap. And I may need to reach further, or I might need to say it in a different way. Your journey through this learning cycle is going to be different for everybody.
Of course it is, and we all think differently. I'm a very visual thinker, so I like to do diagrams for myself. I draw pictures. They probably mean nothing to anybody else, but they help me to consolidate my learning, my understanding. And, so you're quite right. And I love that concept, Pete, of the say again board. I really think
we have, and again, just talk about diversity for a second before we've gone down this rabbit hole. I'll pull us back in a minute. But one last final thing. We had a recruit on a recent course who is a wonderful graphic designer. She's just completed a degree in graphic design and then decided that she wanted to follow her uncle or someone into the emergency services instead. So she came on. And after the first few days of a pumping course, she came back to me and said, oh, I did a little doodle the other night. Oh, my Lord. We've had it made into A1 laminated, which you can put on the wall and people can draw on with board pens to talk about the flow of water through a fire engine and out of the ground and through this and just that. And she showed me and I was like, oh, my God, we would have to pay people thousands of pounds to draw this.
Yeah.
So she very kindly donated it to the service. Wonderful. And we use it as a visual reference tool because that's exactly where we need to be. But so I
love what you did. Before you go on, I just love what you said there. So here's an illustration of people making different choices, isn't it? So here's somebody who's got a graphic design degree and they've said, actually, what I really want to do is this.
Yeah.
And then they're shifting and they're coming across and they're open to learning and they're also brilliantly obviously sharing their own expertise. We have to be open to that as
well, though. Of course we have to, and this is what I'm saying about adult education. You can't stand there and go, what could I learn from a head teacher? I'm a police officer, I'm a firefighter, I'm whatever. No, well, you already know the thing, but knowing the thing and teaching the thing almost require entirely different skill sets. I always say the most wonderful teachers can teach the fundamentals of anything because it's about taking somebody from where they're not to where they need to be. And those fundamentals are often very similar. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. So having that wide spectrum of abilities, like flexing your style in the room, is what it's all about and what I love so much about it. But I wanted to frame the next part of our conversation in around apprenticeships, because we've seen a tremendous explosion in these. And again, some people very young, 18, 19, will be coming in, never heard of apprenticeships in their life, but also people entering adult education again or changing jobs, a career change in their 30s, 40s, 50s, will be familiar with these, but they may not have seen them so prolific in perhaps the last 15, 20 years. So I'm looking at the something around Parliament UK, and it gives us a lovely little framework to start from and around apprenticeships. So they've got in here that master and apprentice from the Middle Ages to 1900. So apprenticeships in England can be traced back to the medieval craft guilds in the Middle Ages, originated from the custom of upper-class parents sending children away to live with host families. By the Tudor period, despite overall numbers being quite small, apprenticeships were generally seen as an acceptable form of training. It was slightly modernized, but they still went with the case of binding servant to master and vice versa, in which the master personally taught the apprentice, took personality for their moral welfare, and gave them lodgings. That was in the 1980s. My goodness.
Yes,
so we've come a long way.
We have. we don't bind people now, so no. We don't do that.
But people will remember maybe 20. My dad ran a building firm for 40 years. So he will have been familiar with things like city and guilds, and there was other variations back there. Can you try and give us, maybe bring us up to speed from the 50s and just tell us about, where apprenticeships are kind of now? Why have they been so, because they played a big role in the COVID pandemic as well. You wrote a lovely article on SFJs as well. So take me into that world, and why have they become so popular again, and how are they useful these days?
Okay, so we don't do some things. We still have the notion of you are learning about an occupation. So that's still the criticality. That's the common theme throughout all of the variations of apprenticeships. We had what were called apprenticeships frameworks for a while. I'm not going to go into the detail of those, but they were the old version. They actually, to some extent, still exist in Scotland, not in England, in Wales to the same extent. Now we don't really have that. We now have apprenticeship standards. The Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, it's another one of those acronyms for a government arm's length body. They have had responsibility for really defining what are occupations and saying there should be an apprenticeship per occupation. So, for example,
that is very difficult.
It isn't easy, and actually, I think it's an evolving picture. Certainly, in some cases now, I know there's a lot of discussion about whether one per occupation is right, because there's variations.
If you're building, for an example, you could say, well, could there be an apprenticeship in brickwork, and could there be an apprenticeship in architecture? But we go, no, just a building apprenticeship.
No, you can't have that. But it is that exactly as you said. It's there's bricklayer, there's architectural technician. There's a variety. So it's trying to find the right balance between being very focused on what the occupation requires, but also recognizing that occupations vary. So, I'm just going to take an example. Let's say within something like policing, you might have people who go on to specialize in firearms, or they go on to specialize in response or community policing or what have you. So the apprenticeship program has got to equip them for that role, but it's not the end of the journey either. So they might go on to do other things. So within apprenticeships now, apprenticeship standards, the standards are set by groups of employers working with people that are expert in the design of occupational standards.
So these are like subject matter experts.
Yes.
Downloading their knowledge to put it in a framework.
Absolutely. And they specify a series of elements of knowledge, of skills and behaviours that are deemed by the employers to be the important characteristics for that occupation. So operational firefighter, for example, we had one version, we're now on version 1.2 because there were amendments made to it. So we have two versions. You've just done that one, there you go.
It worked well, it worked. We made it through.
It does work, and I think the amendments that came in actually helped. And it's a good thing that we're able to do that, because if you with the best will of the world, you try to specify what the standards should be, you set out what the assessment requirements should be, you put it out there, you try something. If it's not quite right, you adapt, and that's a good example of how
all industries are evolving. And we talk about fire and rescue service there. The aspect of rescue has grown tremendously when we look at then electric vehicles and different fire behavior and different construction. And so to be so obnoxious as to say, oh, you didn't get it right first time. Well, no. All of these industries are evolving. We take technology as an example. You couldn't have an apprenticeship in technology because it's an enormous sector within itself.
Exactly right. So the apprenticeship standards now, they're out there. There's a lot of them are well developed. There's a very large number of them now, and one of the other things that has come in with the apprenticeship standard, which is very different from the early days, because in the very early days that you were referring to, the 1500s or whatever, it would have been the master that would have decided, or the guild would have decided, is this apprentice now ready to go out into the field as a fully qualified person? We don't do that now.
I remember, Thatchery. We had a big fire in one of our, and it's become a Thatcher. Apparently, it's a 5-year apprenticeship.
Oh
my goodness.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a dying trade, unfortunately, as well.
It is a dying trade. In fact, as it happens, I'm sort of lost contact with her a bit, but I know somebody whose partner is a Thatcher. But it is a very, very much more specialised than people perhaps appreciate. Okay. So there's a lot of, watchmaker. It's another one. It takes you a long time to develop the skills of watchmaker. So anyway, the thing that we've done in terms of the assessment of apprenticeships, we've said actually for public confidence, the apprentice having gained the right knowledge, skills and behaviours should be assessed by somebody who's completely independent of their employer or their training provider. And that means that endpoint assessment organisations, which SFJ Awards is one, we send out independent assessors. So they don't know the learner. They probably know the employer. Let's face it, in firefighter, everybody knows everybody else a bit to some extent, but they haven't played an active role in the assessment, the training or the delivery of education training for that person. And we monitor that very carefully, the rules, and we alluded to some of the rules and the bodies that are out there. Some of the rules about quality in apprenticeship assessment are about making sure there are no conflicts of interest. So we have to do that. We have to check with an independent assessor. Do you know this person? Have you ever worked with this person?
I think that is where cultures really crumble and the end user pays the cost. And in an emergency services, police, military, NHS, fire service, whatever it might be, we have a lot of that. Oh, well, I've worked with these people for a while, but they're not quite there. But, oh, God, when they finish their apprenticeship, they get a pay rise. And they know that. So I don't want to deny them of it. And there becomes that social pressure and that's really important, because some people have said, well, why would I have somebody from Scotland come and inspect my service in Manchester? They don't know anything about us. And you're like, it's got to be independent. It's so important that it is, so that if the result, unfortunately, is not what people hope it to be, there is an independence from it, and it can be dealt with in a professional manner. So there's not all of that bleed over.
Exactly. I think it really is an important point. And some of the things you alluded to there, would people feel under some form of peer or cultural pressure to pass somebody who then might then have second thoughts about, is this person safe in that crew? And they felt obliged to do it for all sorts of reasons. And it does happen. I mean, we've probably done over 1,500 endpoint assessments now since we started, including for on-call firefighters as well as employee firefighters. And you mostly are, you want them to pass, you want them to get there, but you have to take a very objective decision. Every one of our assessors has to know that you are not assessing, is that person a good egg, as you put it? You're assessing, have they demonstrated the skills? Are they applying the behaviours? Are they using the knowledge they've learned?
I don't care if they do 20 hours a week charity work.
I don't care.
It doesn't matter,
it's not matter. Doesn't matter. If they do something dangerous that is in conflict with those, it's a fail. No, you can't get it. So, I think the importance of that in the apprenticeship movement is something that is really quite critical, not just for the individual, because it says to the individual, your assessment is fair, because you will also get people who are not just thinking that person's a good egg and I'm going to pass them, but if they're part of the same culture, they might be saying, actually, I don't like them, I'm not going to let them through.
Yeah, there's a lot of that
so,
as well.
That happens too. So by having, as a learner, you're going to be assessed fairly, that matters. From the perspective of the local community, you have that extra confidence that all the people, whatever role they're in, that are being assessed, are being assessed robustly and fairly, and therefore and to the same standard across the piece.
So what I found this really useful for as well, as a slight pivot, but we'll come back as well, is speaking with some female chief fire officers, and they're big champions for some of the apprenticeship schemes as well, because the point you make there, and we won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but despite somebody being competent, safe, proficient, and capable in their role, still people have some of those subconscious biases. And certainly as we're trying to increase diversity in different sectors, but certainly the fire and rescue service from, BAME and EDI and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Some people still see women firefighters and go, oh yeah, but can we trust her? Will she be safe? Yeah. Did she meet the standard? Did she meet the standard? Exactly. Is she proficient? Exactly. Actually, in many cases, many women exceed the standard because of that additional pressure that is placed upon them. And something like the apprenticeship scheme, I have found to be very useful in creating a very clear bar, and standard that people need to meet, rather than people's opinions. And kind of makes me zoom out to that national operational guidance aspect, where we've tried to bring everybody back into line with a professional standard, which is exactly what SFJ and people adhere people to. Because otherwise, and it seems so sad and probably surprising to some of the people listening, that emergency services, certainly the fire service, everybody can be guilty of silo working, but they fracture off and start holding people to their own strange standards. And if the standards are above the bar, then that's absolutely fine. If the bar's here and you choose to say, no, I want everybody to meet here, that's absolutely fine. But when it goes in the opposite directions, and bad culture or bad standards leads to a frontline service not delivering that safety to somebody, no matter where they live in the UK, is a really crucial thing that I think apprenticeships are helping us stay away from, for want of a better word.
I think they are, and let's not go down the totality of that rabbit hole, but as a body that really sees ourselves as part of the whole of the protective services. We work with groups like Women in the Fire Service, Women of Colour in Policing, other groups like that, as well as with fire and rescue services, police forces, etc., and other parties, to try and say, look, our job is not to set the standard. Our job is to make sure that there are qualifications that recognise when somebody has met that standard. And an example of that would just be recently, we've just brought out a new Level 2 award in carrying out fire safety checks with the endorsement of NFCC, who obviously we work with closely. There are bodies like the Fire Standards Board, bodies like NFCC, it's their job to say, these are what the standards should be. That's not my job. My job is to say, okay, I can design a qualification or an endpoint assessment process that lets you have confidence that the people who are going to be working in the sector have met that standard. And that's what we try to do. So it's hand in hand.
A very micro example, my wife has just done a qualification in horse teaching, horse instructing, and horse care. And she wanted to start just doing some familiarization. She works with children with learning difficulties. And she wanted to do horse care and maintenance. So I helped her come up with a little framework. She said, I know what it looks like. It's this. And I said, okay, but now how do we break that down? What would the first few steps be? So let's talk about safety around the animal, safety around the yard. Maybe that's step 1 and 2. And then it's familiarization with the stable and how the stable works before we even introduce the horse. And then it's this, and then it's that. And then what does good look like? And just as a really micro example, and then I said that, and that's the end of it. And then you can do, the end result is somebody can safely go in, collar a horse and take it out to the field and release it and clean out the stable. And that, if they just did that all day long, then that's care for that horse. It's a very micro example. But you're right. That's taking those subject matter experts. You are not creating the snap. I don't know how to care for a horse. We've got horses, but my wife is the expert. So it's helping that person go, if we wanted to teach somebody else how to do this, how could we set it down? And what would good look like? What would the standard be?
Yeah. And that's where, we are in SFJ Awards, we're subject matter experts in qualification design, in assessment processes. So we marry our subject matter expertise in that process with the subject matter expertise of the content, the people who do the roles, who do the jobs. So it's a kind of a marriage, if you like. We challenge each other. We get a working group together. The working group says, we think we should include this. And we might say, well, actually, if you do that, you can't assess that. It's just not possible. If you did this, you could assess that and check whether it's there. And that's the beauty of, I think, the working relationships that we have.
You made a wonderful point there, and I didn't want to skip over it, about having a recognized qualification. Now, one thing that's been historically poor and a complaint almost of people retiring out of the emergency services, certainly the fire and rescue service, but I think policing as well, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Historically, there wasn't really many quality. You could say, I've done 40 years in the fire service, I've done 40 years in the police. I think NHS and paramedics are always a bit different because they did have recognized qualifications far longer than we ever have. But military, again, although they did lots of qualifications, i.e., driving, command, and other things. Obviously, I'm not a subject matter expert there, but they came out with skills and tools.
Yes.
But again, the fact that they retired as a commander of X didn't really mean anything. So I think this is something, and maybe you could speak with greater clarity on it, that all of these sectors now, where if they choose to retire after 10, 15, 20, 30 years, they will have a recognized thing. Or equally, if they want to transfer to different services, does that help? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's one thing where working with regulated awarding organisations, not just SFJ Awards, but other, I have to say it, don't I? Other awarding organisations are available. But if you work with and you have just your own internal certification that you give to people, it carries less weight in the minds of other employers than if you have a qualification by a recognised awarding organisation, and that can be almost any of them. From the sort of the more general organisations you mentioned, the guilds earlier, like the City and Guilds, all the way through.
Are they still
SFJ
about?
Awards. Yeah, they are. Yeah, okay, they're very much still around. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I know their chief exec very well. She's great.
I'm sure she's great.
But there are lots of awarding organisations in the UK. We are the only one that's an absolute specialist in the protective services. We don't issue qualifications in, I don't know, plumbing. We just don't do that. We're totally focused on, you mentioned them at the beginning, fire and rescue services, policing, MOD, the prisons,
etc. It can be a bit of a wild west otherwise, can't it? We recently were doing some manual handling training, and we were looking at some of the certification that was given historically, and it came from an osteopathic company. Of course, I won't mention, but when we went down the rabbit hole of Gov UK, there isn't really, and I'm sure listeners will correct me, but there wasn't really a recognised qualification for manual handling. It's a bit vague, and I don't know if it's something you guys and girls have ever got involved in, but it turned out that this certificate we had didn't mean anything. It was just he'd been on a 2-day something, and they'd given me a piece of paper and signed it, but it didn't actually hold any weight anymore.
No, it wouldn't. And that's where I think, as you mentioned it, people retiring or just transferring to take on another role altogether. If you've got a recognised, regulated qualification, it means something. You find, in all our certificates, and I'm sure it's the same for other awarding organisations, you can go in, come back to us. There's a Q code thing. You just can check. Is this real? Is this really the person that did this?
It's a bit like when you try and go back and check your GCSEs. It's quite hard sometimes to actually get access to, oh my God, did I ever have any GCSEs? I can't seem to get them from anywhere.
No, we mentioned very early on in this conversation, Peter, about technology, and that's an example of where technology now has moved on. So it's quite straightforward to do those checking. Whereas, I'm old enough that all of my early certificates are just in paper. They were never.
That's
digital.
My family sometimes it's O levels or it's just a piece of paper somewhere, and they're like, God, I can't lose this thing. Otherwise, I've got no justification of any formal education.
No proof, and that's what it is. It's proof. It's genuine evidence that this person has achieved this standard. And even if you don't necessarily want somebody to transfer into the same occupation, so you mentioned people retiring, somebody who's gained command experience, if they've got a recognised qualification, we'd have qualifications, for example, in incident command. If you've got that qualification, it will be specific, probably, but on the other hand, you can show it to some other employer and they can see these are the things I've demonstrated I can do, and they will involve decision making, they will involve taking evidence and information in and analysing that. So you can see how does that map onto what this role covers.
And you can almost accumulate tokens, a bit like when you do your university degree. You can say, well, I've got a bit of this, bit of that, and collectively this shows that someone has got past experience and or they have the ability to assimilate whatever information might
Absolutely. That whole notion of sort of a credit accumulation and then the ability to transfer that credit that you've gained into other things is really important. I mean, one of the things that I think sometimes people don't always realise is that if somebody they've done little bits of qualification, but that they haven't maybe finished something for whatever reason, could be family crisis, could be all sorts of reasons they haven't done it, depending on how long ago it was. If you then approach the awarding organisation and say, look, I did these 2 units, but I haven't done the 3rd and the 4th yet. does that still carry weight? If I go back on the course to do 3 and 4, can I carry that, or have I got to start at the beginning? Actually, depending on how long ago it was, you probably can carry it. You might have to do a little bit of add-on learning, but you haven't lost it.
No, and I don't know what your relationship is with them, but these are only my thoughts and opinions. That's where I think it's a little bit naughty of organisations such as the Institute of Fire Engineers. I don't know if you're aware of them, but
I do know them.
They have certain things whereby you can do 3 awards, but if you don't do the 4th within a period of time, you don't get a diploma or a degree or a thing like that. And I can appreciate there may be an overarching theory of recent knowledge gained to gain the thing, but there is also a bit of a financial aspect in there, I think, sometimes that says we want you to keep going down this. So, because also I think, well, if I've got that certification, surely it should never run out, and that sometimes for me makes it a little bit naughty. But zooming out for a second about apprenticeships and organizations, if we try to take our minds up to kind of service leadership level, because we do have a lot of senior leadership people listen every now and again around why would I run my own fire and rescue service, why would I want to be involved in it, what's the benefit, what are my staff going to get from it, and how will it help us as an organization? Because they're very popular, so there's obviously a lot of people getting why are they getting involved in it?
Okay, they're getting involved with it for a multitude of reasons, actually, but I'll just list you a few of them. So some of it is about actually there's public funding available so that, to support the training and to support the assessment. So the apprenticeship levy that's levied on certain employers, that larger employers pay a levy. That money is then able for you to use for the training.
Is that levied to invest in just overall societal development then, or what?
It is part and parcel. It's actually about UK productivity.
Okay.
So, the government and all political parties are actually quite invested in apprenticeships as a really important way to make sure that we have people trained to the skills needed and with the knowledge they need to be high functioning and contributing to society. So that there's a financial element to it, but I think that's only part of it, because the other bit of it is, as an employer, and I'm an employer, obviously, one of the things that really everybody's looking for nowadays is an employer that cares about and is invested in you as an employee. Absolutely. And if you are putting in place training arrangements for your staff, whether new staff or existing staff, because you don't have to be a new member of staff to go on an apprenticeship.
Absolutely, yeah.
Then you're actually saying, I care about you. I want you to be the best you can be. I want to give you that training. I want to help you prove that you've got the expertise you need to have to work well in this environment.
Also, we're growing together.
We are.
You're not just like, I've bought you as an asset, and I've attached you as a bolt.
You're not a number.
But you're only ever going to be a bolt.
Yeah,
you're never going to be part of the structure that grows.
You're part of it, and that's that I think plays back into the employers that really are invested in this. They are the ones that want a learning culture in the organisation. So it's a culture that's going to grow, and if you encourage learning amongst the individuals, you actually embody that whole element, don't you?
That's exactly what the whole podcast is about. I always call it learning out loud, because I come on and have conversations with subject matter experts like you, but I just fumble my way through the conversation and I get corrected and pivoted and educated, funnily enough. Do you know what I mean? It's the greatest way of personal development. But if we're not willing to make those mistakes or show that bit of vulnerability, it can be very challenging. And maybe that gives us a nice segue into adult education as a framework in itself, because so a lot of these apprenticeships, you said they haven't got to be a new starter to engage in some of these things, but learning can be, sometimes we get less flexible, we get less malleable in our minds as we get a little bit older. But a lot of people are choosing to change it. COVID was a great thing for this as well, wasn't it? Where people thought, am I enjoying the thing that I'm doing? Now I've had this tactical pause. No, actually, you know what? I've always wanted to be a healthcare professional. I've always wanted to be a police officer, an accountant, whatever it might be. And now they're choosing to do that. But for some people, it's for a lot of us, it's very scary in our 30s, in our 40s to go and do a new thing. So how do you think this sort of helps people with that? And maybe just shine some light on how difficult it is for people trying to learn at that age, but also that it is still possible.
I mean, I think apprenticeships are in an absolutely fantastic way. And I think you alluded to the article I wrote recently. I think they're a great way to help people make changes, because what frightens a lot of people who've been out of early learning for a long time, let's call it early learning, is the notion that they have in their heads that learning involves sitting in a classroom. And in an apprenticeship program, you're learning on the job. Yes, there's classroom elements to it. Of course there is. And there's, things that you have to go in and study. But actually, you get to put it into practice quite quickly, and you start engaging your whole self really in the learning process,
Immersion.
rather than being, talked at. You are engaging in that process. So for a lot of people, I think we have to get over that fear element. Oh, it's a bit scary. Should I do it? Well, actually, you'll be supported all the way through. So yes, you will be able to do it. And I think the other bit that's challenging, though, for people that come to learning a bit later in life, as indeed my own mother did, as I said right at the beginning, you've got family responsibilities that have increased. Depending on the age you are, you might have small children, you might have a partner in a very challenging role, you might have older people that you're looking after as well as a carer. You don't have that when you're as much. Some do, but you don't have it as much when you're school age. You just don't. So you've got to be able to balance that out. Now, you can balance that out easier if you're also getting some income coming in while you're learning. And if you are going on an apprenticeship program, you have to be paid. Now, all right, you might not be paid at the same level as you would be if you were fully employed, but you know where you're going to go. You know what the journey you're on, and you are at least having some income, and you have more flexibility around how you learn. And the pace at which you learn. Because again, what people may not always realise, although apprenticeship programmes do take, a year plus, depending on the standard, that you can build in a pause. So if something happens in your life as an older learner that you just actually are going to have to take a couple of months to deal with this, you can pause a learning process and then pick it up again and come back to it. So I think a lot of the issues are fear factor for older people, and they're not the same in learning now as it probably was when they were first learning. Even within the college environment, in adult education more generally, there is more flexibility now than there used to be.
Especially even from distance learning, from open universities and things like
Duolingo that we talked about.
There you go. That aspect that they always say that not youth is wasted on the young. That sounds a bit harsh, but sometimes school feels wasted on the young, and wasted is the wrong word, but you value it more. The irony is you pay for it yourself as you get older, and you really appreciate it. And you get that. You said it there really well about learning and growing in an organization, because we're little dopamine machines, aren't we? We like to feel that I am progressing to what I am growing as a person. I can feel these mental or physical milestones that I'm achieving, and that feels a great sense of fulfillment for people, isn't it?
Definitely. And it's what keeps me going. It's what gets me up in the morning. It's the fact that we're having a positive benefit for people, and we do a variety of things. We try and support all sorts of learning activities and events around the country, and just seeing the value of the certificates when they're received. And one thing that we always try to do is publicise stories about people's journeys during National Apprenticeship Week and at other times, to just show, look, this person did it, you can do it too, and look at the gains they've had by that learning process. And that's fantastic.
Absolutely love it. So take us back, because you can tell my excitement and my passion, and I end up interrupting too much, and it's a really bad habit, and I'm trying to get better, I promise. But take us back then to emergency services organisations. They're doing these apprenticeships. They get they're benefiting from a levy. And most of these are between a year and 2 years.
Yeah,
what support do they get from SFJ? Because I know you also work with other partners in like mentoring and or coaching roles. So what do those structures look like?
So basically with SFJ, so there's two elements here which I just possibly need to clarify. That it might be helpful for your listeners, Pete. So there is Skills for Justice. Which covers the consultancy arm, does research, does coaching and mentoring, training and support, all of that side of things. And then there is SFJ Awards. And SFJ Awards is obviously very connected to Skills for Justice. We came from Skills for Justice. But I must admit, I always now promote the SFJ as meaning skills, flexibility, jobs. Not just Skills for Justice, that narrows people's thinking. Whereas what I'm actually talking about is people gaining skills, people developing flexibility in their learning style, and people developing their flexibility in their career path and getting into good jobs. So that's what the award.
That's a much better way. Skills for Justice does sound a little bit like some historic, like white gleaming building that's going to It feels
Well,
like a Crown prosecutional type thing. I don't know in
well,
my mind.
it's historic. I mean, so Skills for Justice was the sector skills council for the health sector, for the justice sector rather. And justice to me is kind of a bit of a misnomer when we're talking fire and rescue, because I don't think fire and rescue doesn't
Justice
sort of sit
implies
in
that the
justice.
opposite is a misjustice, or just
Yes,
it's
exactly.
like
And
someone's
yes,
committing a crime or something.
exactly. And that maybe works when we're talking as we do with policing, the courts, the tribunals, etc. But it doesn't work for everything. But back in the since we had a little bit of a history bit to this discussion, back in the early 2000s, the UK government recognised sector skills councils as being industry-led, employer-led bodies who had the responsibility for promoting apprenticeships, developing national occupational standards, coming up with ways to improve the skills in the sectors that they faced. And Skills for Justice was one of those. And it's retained that name because it's a well-known name, it's a well-known brand. But Skills for Justice does the consultancy bit. So you mentioned coaching and mentoring. We do a lot of coaching and mentoring support to senior leaders usually, who want to develop their expertise in that as part of their own growth and their own organisational development. And then in addition, we have SFJ Awards, which is the awarding organisation and the endpoint assessment organisation. And we work closely together, but we also keep a separation because if, as is the case within different organisations that come to us to say, I want to pick up this qualification, we have to keep at arm's length. So we have to manage our own conflicts of interest. That if somebody's been on a coaching course that somebody delivered within the SFJ teams maybe has done, that we are absolutely clear that the people who look at that are not the same people who have got a history with SF Skills for Justice. So, we have to manage all of that process the same way as we do within the other apprenticeships and standards that we deliver.
It's a tremendously exciting thing to see come in so heavily back into the sector because it both brings standardization, which I'm a massive fan of. And I think a lot of people in motor services are, because we try to deliver something in our minds and hopefully in societies and cultures' minds that really means something without seeming too extremist. A lot of these situations can at times be life and death. But even long before that, you want to know that when you're having the worst day of your life, the men and women that are coming there to help you are all going to be the same. They're held to the same standard. They're all going to be proficient, capable, because that's what the public expects. So what do you expect of your police officer? I expect them to be well-trained, proficient, mentally agile, physically fit, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
We have those standards to hold people to. Where do you see this going over the next decade or so? As these are these going to continue to get bigger? Will we stretching into more sectors? What and also, can people opt out of this? And what I mean by that is, do you anticipate some sectors will go, no, we're just going to do our own thing? As much as that might worry some people, given the justification and framework that we've gone through, are there still sectors? And even in like maybe fire and rescue services or police sectors, are there organisations that can say, we're not going to do this, we're going to do our own thing still?
Well, there's nothing that forces any employer to use apprenticeships or to use qualifications other than the expectations of their own staff and the public that they serve. And so technically, I don't think a sector can necessarily walk away because it's a pan-UK drive, if you like, to listen to sectors. But if sectors were to say, well, we think we should do something completely different, then I'm sure government would listen. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
But they'd likely go, so how do you want to do this thing differently?
And why?
We'll help you do the thing differently. Not like wander off into the woods and do your own echo chamber, because that's not good for anybody.
It wouldn't be, and I think there's a level, isn't there, which as a nation, or we've got the various devolved administrations in the UK do things slightly differently. There's no doubt about that. For example, Scotland, education is a devolved responsibility. So I said at the beginning, Scotland hasn't moved to the apprenticeship standards that we have here in England. It's got apprenticeship frameworks. Lot of similarity at the end of the day, but not exactly the same. There's
the difference there between a standard and a framework is that does that mean that they don't? And I'm sorry, I may be getting this wrong, but are they not holding? Are they just giving guidance then, rather than?
No, it's not. No, it's still requirements.
Okay, sorry.
It's still requirements, but they're differently specified. So in England, an apprenticeship standard defines the levels of knowledge, skills, and behaviour. An apprenticeship framework actually usually does the same, but in a different way. So, and it might include qualifications and other elements beyond just the occupational. So they're just different ways of tackling the same thing, really. And there is, there's recognition, there is elements of transferability. There's no doubt about that. But at one level, what the national and the UK governments have to do is say what is best for the UK economy as a whole. There always has been a drive to say we want employers and we want sector employers to have a voice in how that works. And that has always been the case, but how it's been done has changed over the years. So I mentioned Skills for Justice was a sector skills council. That they were responsible, if you like, for setting standards. Well, they don't set standards anymore. There are other bodies that do that. But what they do is they provide support and advice to help employers meet those standards. So things change in terms of how they operate. I think any sector that said, I want to go out on our own, I think I would have to say why. Because there's a lot of support out there to help you implement things that are out there. Why would you? Yeah, exactly. And for any employer that says, I don't want to do that, I'm going to just do my own, I'd have to say again, why? Why are you potentially making yourself less attractive as an employer to other employers? Because you're not going to be giving your people access to the same qualifications, learning, development, and the recognition as other employers are. Why would you do that?
I wanted to zoom out maybe as we think about bringing it to a close and look without catastrophizing. What do you see? Because over the last 20 years, perhaps, UK economy has gone through a whole tumultuous roller coaster and things have changed. Sectors have grown, others have collapsed, others have been born. We've spoken already about the technology. There are some long stays like the emergency services sectors. We like to think they will always, whilst it's sad that they're required, it's also great that we provide them. If we don't continue to invest in developing our communities, developing our workforce, we already see certain things slipping away from the UK in terms of skill sets and things like that. Without catastrophizing, what do you think is the cost really if we don't take things like this seriously, if we don't think about developing and investing in the development of our staff? What is the cost?
Well, do you know what? You're asking the wrong person, because I would catastrophize about that. I mean, if we don't do that,
I think it's hard not to.
It's very hard not to. It's a bit like the climate emergency. I heard this morning on the radio discussion about if we don't do something about really head-on tackling obesity. A child born today has a 25% chance of being obese by the age of 21. That's a terrifying statistic.
No.
And the more unwell people are, or the more vulnerable people become, then the less productive the society and the less wealth there is in the society, and it's a vicious cycle. So we cannot afford to go down that route. I mean, within the sectors that my colleagues and I work with, Pete, that we talk about them as fire and rescue or policing or what have you. Actually, what they've all got in common is they're all dealing with people at vulnerable points in their lives, and people who often are more vulnerable than other members of the general public are, whether for short term or long term.
So we almost see the cost of the debilitating society.
You see the cost of it. You do. Yeah. Exactly, you do. And, yes, you can catastrophize about it, but I think there's enough of us saying, hang on, we have to make this investment in learning and skills. We have to make the investment in these sectors, or we are sunk over the longer term. We really will go down the pan. We've had, and I think it's probably fair to say that the political parties know that. Of course. Whether they act on it in the way that
sometimes we're a bit too busy fiddling while Rome burns, aren't we?
I think we can do that. I think there is an issue which is well known. I'm not saying anything that people don't know. There is always a challenge for political parties in that they have to think in relatively short terms timescales. Yeah. Because
they work.
They're only in power for a certain time.
We work in quarters and years, and it's like I need to get a result by then. And to do this stuff, you make sorry, I'm interrupting again. You make such a fantastic point. Some of these colossal investments, because we don't see the deterioration of society as such over a year or 3 years. You see it over 10 and 20 years. You go, something's changed, something feels different. Society, community's not what it used to be. But to change that, you've also got to think long term. So you've got to make investments. I always think of it like our local park. The people that planted the trees, the architect of that local park, designed it, knowing he would never see it. He would never see those trees. They were going to take 40 years to grow. But it's that bit there.
It's that long-sighted vision that's so important. I mean, within, we're talking about, there's a lot of challenges in the press around the culture within fire and rescue, within policing at the minute. But all of the reports that have been coming out, you will not change culture in a heartbeat. It doesn't happen like that. It's a long-term process, but you have to get started. You have to start. And you have to look at it as a multifaceted approach. And it's the same with skills. You don't change the skill set of a nation or even a sector in 5 minutes. You change it over a long time scale. And you have to do that in a way that's agile, because you have to constantly keep up to date with what else is happening, what else is changing about the world in which that role will be played out, that we need to be taking account of.
Candace, I've absolutely loved that conversation. I'm not in
it's
any way.
It's been fun, actually. I've enjoyed it a lot. It's good.
Is there any key points there? Because obviously, like I said before we started our conversation, I'm operating out of my own bias. Is there any crucial things that you think we've maybe breezed over or missed there? Because we are going to let people know, obviously, if they want to go and find out a bit more information about SFJ or about the award and bodies, that they can head over to sfjawards.com. But is there any big aspects there that you think maybe we've brushed over that we can maybe touch on before we close?
No, I don't think so, Pete. I think it's constantly evolving. I mean, I've loved having this conversation with you. I kind of feel a very like-minded, the sort of the passion and the desire to see skills development happen. So it's been great fun. I think that the thing I'd leave people with is, please just open your minds and your hearts to the value of learning. Enjoy it for yourself and encourage it in everybody else, because it makes a huge difference to everybody. You feel better. You mentioned it, the dopamine rush, the endorphins that come out when you're learning something new.
But also, and I say it to people when I go to the playground and pick my daughter up, your kids and people around you, they don't just learn with their ears, they learn with their eyes. They see what you're doing. And when you're saying to them, go into school and do the really scary thing, go and do the scary exam, go and do that local club on a Saturday and meet people you don't know. Well, are you doing it, Mom? Are you doing it, Dad? Are you doing it, brother, sister, auntie, uncle, whoever you might be? That eternal student mindset. They say the world belongs to the learner, don't they?
It does.
If you're willing to continue to learn and evolve and develop, then you'll stay with the tide as it rises up and down.
Yeah, and I'm just going to prove that to you, actually, if you'll indulge me for a minute. And I apology to any native Norwegian speakers with this. Right?
Oh, please, let's.
Jeg elsker å lære. I love to learn. That's me.
Candace, that is a beautiful thing for us to finish on. I've absolutely loved that conversation. I sincerely hope you'll consider maybe in a year's time or 6 months' time, maybe we could revisit something.
Definitely.
See where we're at and everything's come on board and everything's happened.
Let's do that, Pete. Great talking with you.
Really appreciate your time this morning. Take care and I'll speak to you soon.
Take care. Bye for now. Bye.
Firefighters podcast is put together to develop, inspire, and hopefully even motivate those individuals who have chosen to serve our communities and be part of the first responder family. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield. If you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to see the podcast continuing, please head over to our Patreon page where you can support the ongoing efforts of the podcast. Please hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on whatever platform you're listening to. Please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.